Hello, I'm Corianne Scally. I'm a Principal Research Associate in the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center at the Urban Institute. And it's my pleasure to welcome you today to this webinar on applying an equitable framework for housing policy response during COVID-19 and beyond. First, a few housekeeping items. This event is being recorded and the recording will be posted online afterward. These slides and speaker biographies are also available online at urban.org. And while all participants are muted, you may type your comments or questions into the Q&A box at any time, and we'll be reserving time at the end of our webinar to make sure we circle back to those. Finally, we'd love for you to engage with us on Twitter. Feel free to tweet with the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. Our format for today starts with a brief presentation from me, followed by a moderated panel with a great group of practitioners, and leaving time for Q&A at the end. I'm presenting an overview of a recently released report, and I would like to first acknowledge my co-authors, Elizabeth Champion and Michael Neal, my colleagues at the Urban Institute, and also Enterprise Community Partners for being a partner on this work. Our goal was to forward a set of core principles that should not just be implemented together in response to COVID-19, but also leveraged to address longstanding racism and inequities in our housing systems. To distill these, we analyzed past housing policies enacted after Hurricane Katrina and to mitigate the mortgage crisis and Great Recession. And we applied an economic mobility and racial equity lens to them. A framework for equitable housing recovery should advance economic mobility. More specifically, drawing on the work of the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty, this extends beyond the goals of economic success to also promoting people having power and autonomy to direct their lives and to have a sense of belonging and being valued in their communities. A framework for equitable housing recovery should also center racial equity. This means making it an explicit goal at the beginning, desiring to achieve equitable outcomes, including eliminating race completely as a determinant of outcomes and thriving. It also means embedding racial equity within all processes by engaging those most affected by racism in all aspects of implementation. Finally, a framework for equitable housing recovery should learn from the past. To advance these three goals, we profiled 7 policies and programs responding to Hurricane Katrina and the Great Recession across how well they exemplified the goals of economic mobility and racial equity. In practice, as you can see on this chart, these policy responses tended to focus more on economic success with less attention towards power and autonomy and very little to building a sense of belonging in community, such as trying to avoid displacement. Almost every policy we reviewed failed to explicitly center racial equity as a process or a desired outcome. Going forward, we recommend advancing racial equity in policy processes and outcomes by elevating the voices of people of color in setting policy priorities and program guidelines that most affect them. Tracking outcome metrics by race and ethnicity is also critical to holding programs accountable for achieving equitable results. Despite a rough track record, we did find some examples to build on. One such example is the Unified New Orleans Plan process in response to Hurricane Katrina. We found that this inclusive recovery plan elevated resident voices while prioritizing displaced residents and purposely integrated racial equity into the planning process. Another example to build on from the Great Recession is the National Foreclosure Mitigation Counseling Program. This program funded individualized counseling tailored to homeowners' unique financial conditions, helping them to discuss and understand their options and helping many to avoid foreclosure. It was also available to homeowners for a decade, acknowledging the lasting effects of crisis. and did track the race of program participants, even though racial equity was not an explicit program goal. We've distilled 4 key policy principles from past crises responses. These principles ensure that the needs of all housing market participants, including small landlords, are met in a way that promotes racial equity, economic successes, belonging in community, and power and autonomy. For each principle, we suggest tested strategies that have been employed in past crises or have a solid evidence base today, along with some promising solutions being tried out already during our current crisis. We believe these 4 principles need to be pursued together, although the specific implementation strategies may vary based on contextual factors. So our first principle is to keep all renters and homeowners housed while targeting those with most need and maximizing their choices. This is an obvious starting point. We don't need to have people losing their housing during a pandemic. But in addition to the more obvious approaches to making sure that rent and home mortgages are paid, I would like to highlight strategies to simplify access to help, including setting a low bar for eligibility and ensuring that help extends as long as people are experiencing crisis. Our second principle is to maintain a steady supply of affordable housing and mortgage financing. We don't want to see either small property owners and landlords lose their properties or homeowners lose their homes. Both actions can reduce supply and affordability. We list out a series of strategies to make sure that loans get repaid or modified over time and that at-risk units are saved. The third principle is to stabilize communities by increasing power and autonomy and the sense of belonging. This principle focuses on the right to stay put and belong where you are by targeting investments to hard-hit communities and centering community voices in response and recovery. Displacement hurts, so let's avoid it by helping people stay rooted where they want to be. And we know that communities of color are most vulnerable to destabilization in the face of crisis. Our last principle emphasizes centering real people in solutions through individualized attention and holistic care, and by simplifying program navigation, making help both easy to find and to understand. This acknowledges that crisis is traumatizing, but policies should not be. We believe that embracing these 4 principles together will aid in a more equitable recovery from COVID-19, but also lead to longer-term transformational changes across housing systems. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator of our panel today, Alexa Rosenberg. She's the Senior Director of National Initiatives for Enterprise Community Partners, where she co-leads Enterprise's economic mobility initiatives that focus on the nexus between housing and mobility from poverty. Alexa, thanks so much for joining us today.
And for the introduction and for that overview. Enterprise was really eager to partner with the urban team on this research project because we know from past experience that if we don't look around the corner a bit as we implement pandemic housing relief and recovery strategies, we will exacerbate housing insecurity and loss of ownership, particularly for Black and Brown folks in this country. So thank you and your team for this work. Now I'm honored to introduce our panelists who will expand on this topic based upon the work they are each doing in their communities. And panelists, remember as I introduce you, please unmute yourselves and show your video. Maeve-Elise Brown is Executive Director and founder of Housing and Economic Rights Advocates, also known as HERA in California. Michelle Wetton, my colleague, is Vice President and Gulf Coast Market Leader for Enterprise Community Partners in New Orleans. And Paul Young is the Director of Housing and Community Development for the City of Memphis. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So my first question, just to get us going here, is can you each kick us off with a basic overview of how you've seen the pandemic affect the housing needs of people in your communities? And we know that many needs have just been further exacerbated by the crisis, but I'm curious if there have been any surprises for you. And we can start maybe with Maeve-Elise.
Certainly, happy to start. Hi, everybody. Thanks for doing this. Thanks for the work and for the opportunity to participate. So we're a statewide nonprofit law office based in California with an anti-discrimination and economic security, economic justice mission. And so we work across quite the range of people. Whether you're homeless or a tenant or a homeowner, you land at Harris' front door. Everybody is sort of bound together in America by debt and credit, by many things, but debt and credit are certainly a couple of those things. And so we have seen the spectrum of people with experiencing the challenges and pain of the pandemic. Loss of landlord wealth, intergenerational wealth loss has been really, the danger of it and what we're seeing in process has been one of the striking features of what comes to our door. We sit in an unusual position because it's not traditional for legal services programs to work on homeowner issues, much less to speak to small landlords. We have found about 60% of the small landlords are seniors, 75% are people of color, something like 15% are limited English proficiency. These are 1 to 6 unit property owners. And they're such an important piece of the housing provision puzzle. For them to be in tremendous danger, it's been really eye-opening to see how they're managing or really not managing under the circumstances. And then the implications for loss of family wealth for this block of women and people of color. So that's been surprising. I'll say something else surprising has been how much suspicion there is over forbearances and grant programs. I'll be really interested to hear Paul's experience because we, for example, are administering a grant program and we've had people demand to know who we really are and what our game is. We've also had lots and lots of contact with people all over the state who are frightened of forbearances because they're desperate not to fall behind at all. So there's also this residual trauma that people have from the most recent foreclosure crisis that has been surprising.
Yeah, really important. Let's go to Paul. I'm interested in what you're seeing in Memphis.
Yeah, thanks, Alexa, and thanks everyone for holding this important conversation. Glad to be here today. So I serve as the Director of Housing and Community Development for the City of Memphis, and obviously we've had a whirlwind of activities over the last few months. And one of the things that was most surprising to me early on in the pandemic was the lack of concern from the landlords, and not concern for the tenants, but just concern about their well-being. They felt like they were doing okay during the months of April, May, June. We even held convenings with many of the large landlords in our community, and what they were telling us was that they were actually seeing prepayments, which blew me away because I just thought that we were going to be seeing our landlords in distress. But they said at that point in time that they still were very, very concerned about what was going to happen in the fall, and their concerns have turned out to be true. After some of the initial stimulus support that had kicked in during those late spring, early summer months, after that we were and still are seeing many people and families that are on the cusp. They are really, really struggling. Right now. We've had a number of issues around the space of homelessness. So these are individuals that were already homeless in some instances, but we're also seeing a high uptick in calls from families and individuals that are on the verge of being homeless. And so we're trying to work with those families to try to find places for them and really trying to stabilize the places where they are currently staying. Like Maeve, we heard from our small landlords. An interesting story. Early in the pandemic, I had been on a local TV station, and they were asking me about what resources we were going to apply to help renters. And I had mentioned something around the moratorium that was in place, and I had gotten a call from a small landlord, and she gave me a real earful because she talked to me about how she was on retirement, and this was her only income, and her tenants were hearing me say that they didn't have to pay rent anymore, and she was very distraught about this. And I later heard similar sentiments from many small landlords that were really experiencing some challenges because they only had a couple of tenants, and those tenants aren't able to pay. It really means a lot to their income. So a lot of times we think about the pain that the tenants are feeling, but some of those small landlords are feeling similar challenges. One other thing that I wanted to mention around what has been surprising, and it wasn't so much surprising as it was revealing, and that's the issue around broadband connectivity. We in Memphis, our schools, Shelby County schools, has been 100% virtual since the pandemic hit, and we have some students that still have not attended any classes for various reasons. I was talking to a homeless family a couple of weeks ago, and their kids, three of them, had not been to any classes because the hotel for which the city was providing support for didn't have connectivity at the hotel. And so we worked out some ways to help that individual family, but we still have some significant challenges. So as we think about housing, we also want to think about connectivity as a form of infrastructure. The same way we think about sewer and utilities, we also need to be thinking about broadband in that way, and that's how we're starting to think as a city.
Absolutely. Michelle, how about in New Orleans?
Thanks, Alexa. Yeah, so I oversee enterprises work in Louisiana and Mississippi and parts of Texas, but for today's comments, we'll be focusing mostly on New Orleans. And I think it's important to understand the context a little bit in New Orleans pre-COVID, which, over a third of New Orleans renters are paying half of their income on housing expenses pre-COVID. Our economy relies, probably similar to Memphis, but relies heavily on tourism. And we have a lot of relatively low wage jobs in the tourism industry and service sector. And those jobs are disproportionately held by people of color. We have a super high poverty rate among Black families. That's 3 times that of white families. And like Memphis, we have a lot of mom and pop owned small rental properties. So over half of our rental properties are in small buildings. We also have a super low unemployment payment standard. So our unemployment maxes out at $247 a week, but the average unemployment payment is $180 a week, which is the lowest in the country and really less than half of what's considered necessary for a single person to pay the bills. So with COVID, the brunt of the downturn has been felt by the hospitality and service sector, as in many cities. But in New Orleans, as I said, a disproportionate number of these jobs are low wage and held by Black men and women. And they also happen to be those that are hardest hit by COVID. And they also happen to be mostly renters who are struggling to pay the rent. So my real concern is what's going to happen in January when the eviction moratorium expires. And the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Coalition is projecting as many as 140,000 families potentially losing their housing in January, February, when the moratorium expires. And the rent is due, because the rent is not just magically not due when there's a moratorium. And Louisiana and the state and the city have made as much rental assistance available as they can scrape together, but it's not been nearly enough to address the need. One real anomaly, I guess, in the housing market has been the strong single family home sales. We've seen prices in New Orleans up about 5% from last year. And I think part of this is really a reduction in supply. There have been fewer houses on the market this year compared to last year. And certainly the dramatic decrease in mortgage interest rates is really driving demand for that. But on the flip side, mortgage lenders are requiring higher credit scores and larger down payments. So it's making it more difficult for first-time home buyers to get into the market and to access those homes. And I guess one other thing that has to be mentioned related to Louisiana and COVID is at the same time as we've had COVID, we've had 7 hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico this hurricane season. So that has been a real double whammy for many families, particularly in Southwest Louisiana, who have lost their homes to the hurricane in the midst of the pandemic. So it's been an extremely challenging time.
Yeah, so speaking of many whammies, this is not the first crisis that you have experienced in New Orleans with implications for housing. You've worked and lived in the Gulf Coast region through a series of past housing related crises, including Hurricane Katrina and the Great Recession. And we know that housing responses to those crises often fell short of addressing racial inequities and advancing upward mobility. What's gone wrong with these past responses, and how can we better promote equity and mobility from poverty as we respond to and eventually, hopefully, recover from this current crisis?
I guess the short answer is they don't address the 4 recommendations in the Urban Institute report. So a good place to start would be to read the report and follow those recommendations. But as you said, we've had enough disasters occurring in the last 15 years since Katrina to have plenty of evidence that low-income people and people of color are the hardest hit by natural disasters and have the hardest time recovering from disasters and now crises like a pandemic. And that is not to take away from the trauma inflicted on everybody, regardless of income, regardless of race. But there are some who are disproportionately affected, and we have seen it time after time. Just a few examples of this: if you don't have savings or access to transportation or family nearby to provide a place for you to stay, it is very difficult for you to safely evacuate prior to a hurricane or a disaster. So you are more likely to be in harm's way when a disaster strikes. Housing that costs less tends to be located in riskier areas that's more prone to flooding on lower lying ground, and historic racist practices and redlining tends to put people of color in neighborhoods that are more susceptible to flooding and other risks. Lower income people are more likely to live in housing that's poorly built, more susceptible to wind damage again and flooding. And renters generally have a more difficult time recovering than homeowners because they lack insurance. If you lose all of your home furnishings, you don't have insurance to replace those items. Often renters' security deposit is really their savings. And if you are displaced from your apartment due to a disaster, you may not be able to recover your security deposit. And finally, it takes low-income homeowners longer to rebuild, often because of lack of insurance or other assets, lack of savings to be able to start rebuilding. You have to wait to get your insurance or your federal disaster resources, which can take a very long time. So you're in limbo for a long time where other families might have savings to start rebuilding. So having said all that, I think disaster recovery programs generally are designed to be accessed equally by everybody and really don't take into account the disproportionate impact on low-income households and people of color, which means that resources really aren't addressing the inequities. I think there are a few other things I'd like to point out. I think public officials often, they want to be able to make commitments that funding will hit the street in 6 months, or we'll get money out there so you can start rebuilding. And that often means that there's some urgency for programs to get designed without real adequate input from individuals who would be accessing or using those programs. So I think public input processes get short-circuited. And I think there are ways to get really important public input from low to moderate income people who will be needing and using those resources, even if they have evacuated. There are ways to incorporate their input and feedback into program design so that those resources meet their needs. And then on the developers and contractors and nonprofits that will be part of the rebuilding process, I think often there's minority-led nonprofits, minority-owned development firms get overlooked for those contracts. And I know certainly in the case of Katrina, there were philanthropic resources in the early days that were relatively plentiful that nonprofits benefited from, but it was really the organizations that were able to access the federal resources that have been able to grow and multiply in the years since Katrina. And a lot of the pre-Katrina existing, mostly minority-led nonprofits missed out on those resources and are struggling financially now. And those organizations played really important roles in the neighborhoods that they served, but those roles weren't necessarily valued by the programs that were designed and administered to support the recovery. So I think we need to do better in recognizing the value of those kinds of organizations in our recovery program design.
Yeah, going to something you said about centering impacted people in the design of solutions, I'd like to go to Maeve Elise. This is one of the policy principles that shows up in the paper, and I'm interested centering people in the policy response, including ensuring holistic, individualized attention to struggling renters and owners can help and help navigate their options is really important. So can you tell us how HERA is working to center people in its pandemic response? And are there places where policy reforms or innovations could help do that better?
Great, yes. It was really striking. I know when we were talking in preparation for the panel, and we talked about how in our experience, in our memory, and everybody's memory, I think the fact that the national response to the Great Foreclosure crisis was to focus primarily on financial institutions. There are strategic reasons that folks could argue over endlessly about whether that was the right choice. But I would say that I think that it was a foolish choice in the way that it was balanced primarily towards financial institutions with people last in line. And so putting people first is absolutely essential, we think, to taking an ethical and equitable path, charting that path to recovery. We center people in our work by realizing there's just not a one-size-fits-all solution for most folks, and by trying to learn iteratively from the people whom we're serving. So it's for example, been really interesting to us to learn how many of our clients have a small business on the side while they also had pre-pandemic, paid employment from a third-party employer. It's been interesting to see how many people have spent down their life savings in order to keep paying the mortgage because they're terrified of falling behind at all. We've had some renters who have done the same thing. Renters, as Michelle is saying, are typically going to have less in the way of reserves anyway, and yet we have seen some of our renter clients who spent down still whatever they had because local financial assistance was insufficient to keep them current, and they were terrified. We've also seen the inverse, which is of widespread and lack of accurate information about what the rules of the road are, and that's really negatively impacting those who are most vulnerable, because their choices are going to have a longer term ripple effect. Their choice about where to spend precious resources, how to figure out where they're going to live, that's going to have quite a big ripple effect for their future. So the individualized, holistic attention to each person is invaluable. People's lives are messy and complicated. People have a layered credit card debt with student loan debt. They have maybe in school, they may have other family members living with them more than ever, which creates complexity in terms of what the household needs. And so with more people more millennials having returned to the family home, I think, than we've had since the Great Depression, we have this really complicated pod now that comes to us. And we think it's our task to try to address, we have the person in front of the pod's needs or acknowledge that and ask our client in front of us, how does this bigger picture of your new household, your expanded household, how does that fit into your goals? I'm not sure that type of analysis always filters up to state level or federal level policymakers, but I think it needs to, and it's particularly for households of color and for women. It's going to make a huge difference in terms of their ability to recover for the long haul. People of color and women had not finished recovering from the Great Recession. And so this just layers onto the problem. One other thing I want to just note about insufficiency of accurate information and on the policy front is it's been shocking to me how many tenants and landlords alike have no idea what the law actually is. Worse than usual. So this is not me being a lawyer going, you don't know what the law is. Of course, you don't expect people who are not immersed in it every day to know. But our landscape, to know everything, but our landscape has been changing very, very quickly. So we've had a series of moratoria issued at the city, county, and state level and federal level. And at none of those levels has there been a really great job done of letting people know what the rules are and how the layers interact. I have, in fact, quite honestly, heard from many small landlords that they can't get representation because the landlord attorneys just don't want to deal with it and are confused themselves, which is fascinating. So better information will help people avoid being scammed. Another hallmark of the foreclosure crisis was the prevalence of foreclosure rescue scams that led to loss of the family home. So in remembering that lack of reliable, accurate information and the failure to disseminate what those policies are that have been created also leads to worse outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to go to Paul now, who is a policymaker at the local level and who's been trying very hard, I think, to center people in the city of Memphis's response. Paul, often we see that the opportunity for systems transformation lies at the intersections of particular policies, programs, or sectors. And in Memphis, I know that you have used your CARES Act housing and community development funding to create some new supports and strategies that align with multiple of the policy priorities identified in the paper. And you've also done so in collaboration with partners from other sectors, for example, with partners in the education space. Can you talk about how you've done that and why you think these near-term strategies might better advance racial equity and upward mobility in the longer term?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a couple of examples that I would point to. One, we just received, I guess most cities received, back in September, October, we received notice that we received a second allocation of CDBG CARES Act dollars. And with that tranche of funding, what we wanted to do was collaborate with our partners throughout the community. So we work with an organization called Seeding Success, which does a lot of convening around education issues and other issues and how they intersect with education throughout our community. And we allowed that group to convene a group of partners to inform the city on how it should allocate those community development block grant dollars. And so we're getting ready to put out some additional funds to support rent and mortgage assistance. And this was informed by that group, as well as some dollars to expand digital equity, which is something that this group was really, really high on. Another program that we've done in collaboration with the community, and this one is one that I was really proud of, is the Eviction Settlement Fund. So anybody that has done work with municipalities know we're not always the quickest to move and implement programs and initiatives. And between March and June, we were able to establish a completely new program where we have now paired legal support with tenants that are facing eviction. And so now those previously unrepresented tenants now have legal representation, and then we have dollars that are allocated to make settlements. The reason that's historic in itself, not just the legal representation part, is, previously these landlords would have filed the eviction, had a tenant removed from the property. They would have a judgment against that tenant. Most likely, they would not get paid from that judgment, but the tenant would have a strike on their record. And so they have a more difficult time trying to find housing in the future. Now, the tenant will no longer have that strike on their record. The landlord will get dollars that they previously would have had to write off. And they will also be able to have those future dollars because the tenant has now caught up on rent and now they're able to pay rent moving forward. So programs like that were established using CARES Act dollars will now be able to proceed into the future under that same structure using newer city dollars or dollars from other municipalities around Shelby County. So we're really excited about programs like that and opportunities to innovate. And so that's one of the things that I'm hopeful will stick around with us beyond this pandemic.
So I'd like to hear from all of you about what else you hope will stick around. What's the most important policy shift you hope will take root in response to this current housing crisis and beyond that might help to mitigate racial inequities and advance economic mobility? Anybody interested in jumping in first?
Yeah, I'll start because I just kind of started off with that last comment. For me, my hope is, and it's not just COVID-19, I think there's just a growing awareness of inequity in this country with all of the events that have happened in 2020. And so I'm hoping that awareness will continue to drive many of the people that are working in this space to improve circumstances for individuals and families. I'm also hopeful that there's been a systems alignment of sorts happening around our city where we're all collaborating because we're trying to impact the same individuals. And, previously there were always conversations that happened, but I think that there's a lot more intention that's happening today that I would love to see stay with us.
I think in a similar vein to Paul, I think that I certainly see an effort at coordination in some cities, some counties in our state, and some state level efforts to take a bigger picture view, be expansive in creating policies that address some of the different layers of people's lives. But there's also been, I would hope for there to be still more coordination, for this not to just suddenly be that every effort here disappears, dries up, but instead that we continue this conversation about where people are really at, because recovery is going to take years. True recovery will take years. And that makes, and to recover means really needing to understand where people are at. Not having these one size fits all kind of policies promulgated or forms of relief offered, because it actually doesn't fit people's lives. When you actually spend time talking to people, you realize better that they need individualized assistance to navigate the complexities of their layered financial lives. And I frame it in terms of financial lives, but it's really, finance drives some of the life goals that we have and drives our ability to keep housing, a safe roof over our head. And so it's an underlying element, but remembering what people's life goals are and trying to put those front and center. One last thought is to try to pull back. I would hope, I haven't seen a lot of it, but that we could aim for less positionality in our gatherings, in our meetings, and think broadly. Have more people in the room and that have traditionally seen each other as opponents. Have them in the room to have well-guided conversations and begin to educate advocates of all stripes to in the private sector and in the non-profit sector, to have these bigger picture conversations about how to move people forward, because positionality doesn't move us forward, it keeps us locked. And then some of the positionality is founded in just a lack of information about what's really going on in the outside world. So and one specific example is, and I mean our state, certainly when folks say landlord, they're thinking John Stewart Company, they're thinking of a series of other names, they're linking large property management companies, they're thinking large landlords who can maybe absorb a financial hit for a long time. Most of the landlords in our state are not large landlords. It might be that the total number, that there are many units provided by larger landlords, but you have lots of individual households, and they're households of color. There's somebody these are people's grandma and grandpa who are trying to hang on to something to pass to the next generation. So weaving in consciousness around the racial and gender-based wealth gap in our country, and prioritizing up the importance of addressing this, and how this moment in time is just setting us back, I think is really important.
So right away, I think in response to this disaster, it's crucial that Congress extend the eviction moratorium and pass rental assistance immediately. I think related to our federal disaster recovery framework, we need to figure out how to speed up the delivery of federal resources after a disaster. I won't go into all of them, but Enterprise has some great recommendations on our website for doing this, such as permanently authorizing the community development block grant funding, disaster recovery, CDBG, and really making that automatic after a disaster, so that public officials and housing advocates and others aren't having to spend an enormous amount of time in Washington advocating for resources when they really need to be at home cleaning up and taking care of people's needs after a disaster. We need to incorporate resilient design into all affordable housing to reduce displacement after a disaster. And then more broadly, I think this crisis is really showing us just how precarious all families are. Millions of people are just we've seen one missed paycheck away from eviction, from not being able to provide dinner for their families. We're from not being able to access transportation. Um, and I think we really need to take a look at the way our government benefits are provided, at our social safety nets, and not necessarily replace them. But there are a lot of really exciting models out there. There's one really terrific pilot going on in Jackson, Mississippi, with an organization called Springboard to Opportunities that's providing $1,000 a month in unrestricted cash to Black mothers. 80 mothers are part of this pilot to do with what they want. And it is proven that cash promotes mobility. And it's changing people's lives. So I think we need to look at these privately funded models and see if we can enhance our government assistance programs and better address people's needs, so that when the next sort of pandemic hits or disaster strikes, people are not in such a precarious position.
Absolutely. Thank you all for the conversation so far. Now we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. I know that questions have been coming in already through the Q&A box, but we have a good amount of time for some dialogue with our panelists. So keep putting your questions into the Q&A box if you have them. So I am going to begin with a question for any of you who would be interested in responding. So we're talking about equitable recovery, but to what extent do actors in the housing sector understand how the structure of the housing system itself reproduces inequitable outcomes? Is there a need for better education and planning around how the housing system exacerbates outcomes during crises like COVID-19? Good question. Anybody want to take that?
I'll try. That's a tough question. It's hard to even respond to it, but I do think that actors within the space, particularly those in the community development space, do understand how the housing market creates inequity. It's something that we talk about in Memphis quite a bit. We don't necessarily use those specific terms, but we do talk about how many of our neighborhoods have been ravaged by the market forces. And the market would tell you that East Memphis is the place to invest. And if you look in North Memphis and South Memphis, these are not the markets that you want to invest in, because from an economic perspective, it doesn't pencil out. And so part of my job every day is to figure out how to make that the projects in those areas, the developments in those areas, and the people in those areas, how do we ensure that they get the types of development in their communities that they deserve? It is something that we talk about quite a bit, and I think people feel it, but we can't always articulate how to change it. And so we try to change it by utilizing the limited funding streams that we have, in hopes that one day the market will balance out in those areas. But it's an uphill battle, and I think we need conversations like this to kind of bring those dialogues to the forefront. And we have to figure out how to have these dialogues at all levels. So at our town hall meetings, how do our elected officials articulate this in a way that the community is going to be able to understand and mobilize around? So it's a complex issue, but I do think that there are people that do understand it and are working towards addressing it.
Can I add to that, or try to add to that excellent answer? Brave man jumping in on a very complex answer off the bat there. I think we're ripe for some new approaches to housing. And so, for example, the concept of housing tenure is one that I've really been drawn to, I should say. And a great analysis, somebody here, a professor at Leeds and working with a former grad student at UC Berkeley. But the notion of risk analysis with the type of housing that somebody's in is kind of brilliant, because it's good for us as advocates, it's good for those who are in government, it's good for individuals living in this world to understand that actually some forms of housing are riskier, lead to have a inherent greater risk of displacement. Not something that we think about as the average human, not an approach that most policymakers, that most of us are taking. I think that's a creative way of approaching it. Beginning to puzzle through where we invest our energy, we invest our energy, and then I would want that information to filter to the public so that they can make better informed choices in their life trajectory about what their vision is for housing, safe housing. I noticed somebody in the questions also talked about the commodification of housing. It would be brilliant to have a thorough discussion of that, because the discussions I've participated in, again, have had people who are very positional with bits and pieces of information. It would be great to have a fuller picture, including one that talks about commodification of housing by local government. Nobody talks about property tax in that way. And yet, to me, when I look at a driver of decision-making, housing development, how localities get paid, how they're able to meet their budget is crucially important for untangling the current system that we're in, the current conundrum, because there are constraints placed on localities from having a budget to meet, a bottom line to meet. It would be great to begin to unpack, and I haven't unpacked it, but I'm very aware of it, and I haven't seen anybody really talking about it. People complain about taxes all the time of one sort or another, any tax. But really unpacking the property tax issue and how it drives decision-making by municipalities, I think also has to be a piece of the puzzle.
Question, or should I move on? Okay, here's another one for anybody who would like to take it. We've talked a lot about the plight of renters, homeowners, and owners of small rental properties. What's the role of financial institutions in responding to this crisis? Have any of you had success in working with these institutions in the past few months? And what are the opportunities there? And I think as a kind of sub question, is there scope for tying relief for financial institutions to specific benefits that they render to their clients? For example, passing on benefits from relief payments to loan holders through reductions in interest rates or interest-free extensions of loan terms. Anybody want to speak to that?
I'm happy to kick us off. And one of the failings during the last foreclosure crisis was the fact that the benefits, for one piece of part of the question, the benefits that there wasn't a oversight over to make sure that financial institutions delivered the benefits, passed along some of the benefits of the beneficence they received from the federal government to the public. They were required, for example, those who received TARP funds, who received federal relief funds, financial institutions, were supposed to participate in the Home Affordable Modification Program. But participate in the Home Affordable Modification Program is like what we've been experiencing in our litigation against Betsy DeVos and the Department of Education. You tell them to do something, there's a court order, and they're like, sure, we'll do that. And in one of our lawsuits, they then just sent out piles and piles of decision letters to people based on the decision they were ultimately going to come to anyway. They didn't follow the court's order. In other words, we have to have enforcement. It's not enough to have rules. There has to be beefed up enforcement if we're going to have these systems that require financial institutions to deliver some form of benefit to the public. There's still huge resistance by many to being placed in that position. It's still kind of antithetical to their way of thinking. So, and we've worked a lot with financial institutions over the years in the home preservation context. That it may be slightly unrelated, but I'm thinking of it from our conversation up to now, is that issue about access to credit. And Michelle, I think you mentioned the tightening credit standards in this current context. Well, credit standards had also tightened for home buyers after the Great Recession, and then they stayed tight. And I think there's a huge racial equity question I have in this space. I really feel as if at some point it gave tremendous cover to industry to revert to discriminating against people of color under the guise of, oh, we're engaging in safer lending. So having some bigger kind of unpacking the different ways in which financial institutions play a role in individuals' lives and the lives of people of color and women, I think that would be that's a necessary conversation moving forward.
I just to add to that, I think a lot of the kind of small mom and pop landlords in New Orleans those properties have been owned by their families for generations. So they maybe don't even have mortgages, but they have a lot of other bills related to those properties. They have property taxes and insurance and maintenance costs and utilities. And those are the bills they're struggling to pay when their renters are not paying rent. And the rental income might be that family's only source of income as well. So that's their real challenge now. It may not be about paying the mortgage.
To just jump in briefly, if I may, Alexa, just to add to what you
Go
were
for
saying.
it.
Yeah. I think I've done a lot of research in Michigan and the problem of property tax sales. For $500, you lose everything that your parents and your grandparents worked for. I know it's not the only state where that's happening, but it's been shocking. I know legal services there have developed programs to try to engage, step into the fray, be the purchasers of these homes to be able to basically make them available again to low-income households or low and moderate income. Back to property tax in California, we're seeing people who, elderly homeowners who can't pay the property tax, period. It's like, how poor is poor? Well, to Michelle's excellent point, they barely have enough to get by, really, to eat, to just and pay for utilities. And then the property tax is the last death knell. And so my 2 cents on that really important piece of the conversation.
Yeah, another kind of related question to this conversation we're having, and I know that we saw this significantly in Memphis and other communities after the Great Recession. And Michelle, you spoke to actually the tightening of the homeownership market. What are the other threats facing housing supply right now? For example, are you concerned about the possibility of out-of-town investors buying up existing single-family homes in communities of color?
So yeah, I saw that question, and I definitely that's a major concern for us. We have one community in Memphis, Fraser, is on the northern part of Memphis, an inner ring suburban community, and it had experienced some down years, and it's not quite on the up yet, but values are beginning to inch up. And as we were going through our comprehensive planning effort a couple of years ago, Memphis 3.0, one of the things that jumped out was that Fraser had the highest number of home sales in the city. And when I saw that, I was just baffled, like, how is that? And so we began to dig into the numbers, and what we saw was that we were seeing a significant number of those sales happening with these large investment companies that were buying single family homes. And so now what we have in that community is people that would become homeowners are having to compete with large investors that are able to put down cash and a quick closing. And so they are purchasing homes all throughout that community. And so they already had a lot of rental housing in those areas, but they are becoming proliferated with single family rental housing. And I often say in our community, it's not like rental housing is a bad thing. We do need rental housing. However, we have opportunities to stabilize neighborhoods, particularly those that were built as single family neighborhoods. We do want to try to encourage home ownership to the extent possible. So it is something that we are definitely challenged with. Fraser is not the only part of Memphis that has that phenomenon. And so what we're trying to do is provide more incentives to people that want to buy in those areas. Previously, we only had down payment assistance programs for low income buyers. We've now expanded that to cover middle income buyers as well in the targeted geographies where we want to see home ownership grow. And so we are trying to craft new ways to address this problem and get more people to understand that the ability to purchase and own a home is not so far out of reach as some may think. And so we're also investing more deeply in home ownership counseling. That was one thing that I meant to point out earlier when I talked about one of our COVID relief programs, the rent and mortgage assistance program. We structured it differently. Typically, it would just be a program that local government would set up, and we would have, a application or a phone number. You call and you get in the queue. But what we're doing now is we are partnering with a group called United Housing, and they are working through the home ownership counseling network. So all of the applicants are actually getting home ownership counseling or housing counseling upon application. And so that is helping those people that are applying, even if they're not going to be able to get funding from the program, they're getting that counseling so they can figure out what things they can do to get on the path so they're out of this immediate crunch of needing their cash onto a path of being able to be a homeowner if that is indeed their ambition.
Michelle, anything else to say about kind of constraints to housing supply, which I know has already been seriously constrained in New Orleans following previous disasters?
No, I mean, out of town investors had been a huge issue in buying up our, charming historic single family homes and doubles throughout our historic neighborhoods near downtown and expanding out even into the further out neighborhoods. New Orleans passed a short-term rental ordinance last year, which made a pretty big difference. So it prevents whole home short-term rentals if the owner doesn't live in that house. So that curbed that activity pretty significantly. And then COVID really did. So we've seen a lot of those homes put on the market that were previously listed as Airbnbs during COVID. The downside of that is some of those were you know, local folks who had owned those homes or bought those homes, and that was their source of income, and now they've lost that source of income. So that's been a downside, but definitely a lot of you know, long-term New Orleans families in our historic neighborhoods have been displaced by out-of-town investors, particularly in the years since Katrina.
So with 3.2 million mortgages coming out of forbearance, what are some strategies that can be promoted to help homeowners emerge from the process with their assets?
Well, one of the great programs that we have not seen reinstituted that I think would make a big difference is the Hardest Hit Fund. So Michelle had mentioned the importance of relief for tenants and for homeowners coming down from the federal level. And this would be one of those programs. Hardest Hit Fund funds were disseminated to, as I recall, 23 different states across the country who were hit particularly hard by foreclosure. Flexible funds, local government, state government disseminated. That was incredibly helpful for. That was the difference for many households to be able to hang on to the family home. I know the funds were expended in somewhat different fashions in different states, but the concept is a great one.
I think we might have time for one or two more. I'd love to ask you all this one, and again, anybody can reply. Both during and after COVID, how can we ensure strong community-led solutions and partnerships during these types of crises? What have been some of the most significant barriers to doing this in the context of rapidly changing laws and the context of the emergency?
So I think that post-COVID, we have to. There's going to be so many different fallouts that come from COVID that it's hard to anticipate what all of the challenges will be 6 months from now. Hopefully, it's 6 months from now when we're on the back end. Maybe 9 months to a year. But there's going to be people hurting. There's going to be needs in all of our respective communities, and so I think that we have to have local governments that understand that we have to make decisions in concert with the people that we serve. We have to have local nonprofit leaders and people that are willing to collaborate. And, what I see in Memphis, I'll just speak for Memphis, oftentimes we have very well-intended agencies that they've decided in their mind on a path and they're going to go down that path. I think that given the varied needs for the people that we're going to be serving, there is no one agency that's going to be able to do all. So if we can all think collectively, and I think that's what we're starting to do in this, but if we can think collectively about which agency should run point on various issues, and then do that in concert with other agencies, the people that we serve will all be much better served. And so I think Maeve said it earlier, we need a people-centric approach. And I often tell people, like, the people that we serve don't care if it's the city of Memphis, Shelby County, Memphis Light, Gas and Water, the state of Tennessee, the federal government. To them, it's all government. And government needs to figure it out. How can we lead? How can we figure out how we can get the services to the people in the most efficient way? I know I'm not really answering the question, but I think it's in the spirit of the question is, I think we need our leaders in all facets to step up and just continue the effort to collaborate, because the people will win.
Yeah, I couldn't have said that better. And I think, government now has the benefit of, there are nonprofits and service providers that have been addressing the very basic needs of individuals, providing food and shelter and medical care um, to families, direct services to families now for 9 months, 10 months, and I think have direct access to information on the needs of households, sort of better, more direct information than they've ever had. So government needs to do a better job of listening, and I think the service providers need to do a better job of communicating with government about what the needs are. But the information is there, and I think people need to um, share that information, and the silos need to be broken down, and programs need to do a better job of addressing the real needs of residents.
I mean, both what you and Paul had to say, to me feels absolutely right on target. And I think uh, to add briefly, the things look different everywhere. Not every place has the infrastructure of nonprofits on the ground ready to go. So just thinking, so conceptually, yes, absolutely. Let's gather and make sure that the powers that be, government, just with the big G, all gathers available information, but then also gathers it with a grain of salt, realizing what information is missing from each provider, because we do tend to be siloed in services delivery. And yet people don't live their lives within the silo of your organization. We live our lives in this world. And that means we're touched by many different factors, and there's no one single organization that actually has that type of information that government and other policymakers really, really need. So information gathering, yes. And I feel as if the three of us have talked about the provision of help right now. Yes. These got agencies on the ground, at least in many locations, that can do that. But how do we move out? How do we get out of our chrysalis? How do we get out of our own ways and our traditional way of thinking about the delivery of housing? Even the way I say it is traditional, and that's annoying. How do we make sure that people have access to what they want and need? That I feel like that's the next urban paper. How we begin to take that broader view. How do we and get all of both government and service providers out of our own way, out of our own more traditional ways of thinking about how things get done, so we can craft something new for when we're past this particular disaster, so we can be building and not always playing defense.
So final question. I would love to know how, a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, if we do better this time around, how will we know? What kinds of data points, what kinds of stories will you be tracking to understand whether we are recovering in a more equitable fashion this go round?
I'll start, and I want to thank you all, Urban and Enterprise, for coordinating this, by the way. What I would look to is, are our indicators as a city better than they were before the pandemic? We've always had a significant issue around evictions. We've always struggled with poor quality housing. We've always struggled with poverty. Are our indicators better than they were before the pandemic? I think that's the way that we should gauge it. We're doing a lot of things right now in emergency fashion. How can many of these things that we put together last, and how can we take some of these tools that we're starting to innovate around to the next level into other areas of opportunity? to help people.
Yeah, I think it's the racial wealth gap. I think it's the health outcomes along racial lines, especially, and housing insecurity, and how we're doing along, I think, all three of those indicators.
Only other thing I would add to that is credit, because credit is used sort of like your passport in America and elsewhere in the globe. Your passport to access. It's also a guise that hides unlawful discrimination. Credit is a complicated thing, the way that it's used, complicated and yet somehow so obviously simple, the way that it's utilized in our country. So I would like to see, I would be tracking, and we're going to be looking as an indicator at how people's credit, how they're doing credit wise, but also how are providers judging that credit. So for example, so during the time when I was on the CFPB advisory committee during the Obama administration, the issue of medical debt and how that was dragging people's credit scores down, and yet was not a good indicator about their likelihood of paying on anything else. This was a brilliant bit of research and the advocacy within the industry that took place afterward and elsewhere. I think we're going to need that moving forward. So both looking at credit as an indicator, not just credit scores, but how are people going to use credit to benefit people and not just against people?
Thank you all so much. It's been a really rich conversation, and thank you, Urban Institute, for hosting us. And thanks to all the attendees for joining us. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.